We have to start right now, so I please request everybody to sit down and get ready for the session. Well, the instructions we've received are very strict, so we have to start right now, finish sharp at 1 o'clock, and the idea is to have a vibrant conversation among the panelists, and also to have some room for a conversation with the audience. So I would like to start immediately. I mean, as you all know, the idea of this panel is to discuss this very, I would say, kind of strange phenomena of the endurance of this communist regime. There are only a handful of communist regimes that are still around in the world. Cuba has, as a regime, has lasted for 60 years already, 6 decades. And so the idea is to discuss the specifics of the Cuban regime and also to try to draw lessons from transitions in other parts of the world, draw lessons from the experience here, the Velvet Revolution and the fall of the Iron Wall, to see to what extent these experiences also are relevant for Cuba. So I would like to start asking Wilhelm, who's the director of the Konrad Adenauer Institute for Spain and Portugal, who has a very relevant international experience. Ask him, what do you think are the reasons that explain this endurance of the Cuban regime?
Thank you very much, Miriam. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to participate in this panel. Well, I first would like to give eventually 4 bullet points, which I see as the most relevant characteristics of the regime, and then I will also reply to your questions about the endurance, and I will touch the question of endurance already in my first bullet point, which is continuity and cohesion. I think this is one of the main characteristics of the regime, that despite the change of leadership which happened over the last years, especially last year with the new president, the governing elite continues to be very coherent over the 60 years of the regime, and this probably is the main reason for the endurance of the regime. The new president, for instance, in his campaign in favor of the constitution, which was approved by a plebiscite this year, the main point for him was at his hashtag, Somos Continuidad. We give continuity. Yeah? So nothing did change, and this is quite important for the governing elite, the cohesion, and that nothing will change abruptly. I think this is one of the main points for the regime. The second bullet point is that we see a lot of new and also some old inequalities. The regime in Cuba, or the society, is becoming more less equal. A lot of new social problems, which is very interesting and probably very challenging for the regime. We have economic, social, and also racial inequalities. You know that the main group which is leaving the country nowadays are youngsters, and these are white people. And the white people send a lot of money back to white people in Cuba, $3.5 billion a year, and this is increasing the social inequality, and this probably will bring a lot of problems for the regimes in the future. We have still very low salaries. The average salary in Cuba actually is about $30 a month, which is very low. And again, more the white people, the better educated people, which receive better salaries. And this is a big problem. We have, on the other hand, a broadening of the access of digital, but digital internet and so on is still very highly controlled, so there is not a free access to the internet and a free access to information. The third bullet point I want to make is about the economic situation. The economic development is nearly at a standstill situation, actually. We have two serious structural problems in Cuba, which is, by one hand, the inefficiency of the public sector, which always had been inefficient, but in nowadays it seems that the cost of this inefficiency is increasing. Although we have some more private sector activities, the new constitution did allow more private activities, but nobody knows exactly where this will go to. We have more tourism, but we have also, in the tourism sector now with the new American government, less tourists from the United States, and so there is a problem. And the second problem in the economics area is the dysfunctionality of the monetary system. You know, they have practically two currencies. They have the official currency with the official change rate and the local peso, and which brings a lot of problems. Raúl Castro, since a couple of years, tried to end up the system, but he didn't succeed. And the third point, I think we will discuss later more intensively, is an international context which is becoming more complicated for the regime. So asking for the endurance of the regime, I would say the first aspect for the endurance of the regime is the cohesion of the elite. This has to do also with the position, in my view, of the United States, because having always the United States as a big threat against the island and against the governing elite, this contributed for the cohesion of the elite and the endurance of the system. The system of the regime had a lot of external aid over the years, until '89, the support of the Soviet Union. Then they had some years, some very flat years, some problematic years, and the regime opened in that time, in the early 90s, but then came Hugo Chavez and they got a new area of support from abroad. They always had some kind of abroad from other Latin American countries, and not at least the image of Fidel, who was always fighting against the big threat from the north, helped the regime. The second one, what is the heritage of this regime? This was also a question of Miriam put to us. I think at the end of the day, there is no real heritage at the moment, because we have a new generation. We have already the third generation after the revolution, which is not very much linked anymore to the guiding ideology which dominated the regime, and the myth of the leaders is also fading out. So Fidel and others are not known anymore by the new generation. So I think the legacy of the regime is not really existent. The third question was about changes of the regime, which could eventually change the regime. I think the economic crisis will get worse, and this eventually will have some impact on the regime, and of course the inequality, the growing inequality in the regime may also change. Nevertheless, and this is the fourth and last question of Miriam, what can we expect with regard to transition? I think for the moment we will not have, or I do not forecast so many changes. The system is still very strong. The system, the endurance of the system also has to do with a very well working repressive apparatus. And this is still going on. The regime is a repressive regime. We have a high number of political prisoners and so on and so forth. So the authoritarian or even totalitarian character of the regime will not change. And we have a very weak democratic opposition because of the control, because of the limits, also because of the island character of the country and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, my perspectives regarding democracy of Cuba are not very optimistic.
Thank you, Wilhelm. Despite the non-optimistic outview, I think this helps us set the discussion in very interesting terms. So I'd like to ask Danae Vilches, who's a Nicaraguan journalist, to explore this aspect that Wilhelm mentioned, and I convey this idea when we exchange messages about the legacy of the regime. How do you sense and how do you experience the legacy of the Cuban regime from the Nicaraguan perspective?
Basically, Nicaragua is a follower of the ideology, but I think more of the ideology and in reality itself is more of the discourse. So Ortega, for example, uses the same rhetoric the Castros have used, and he's using it right now despite his policies are not communist. So there's a contradiction for them between the discourse and what they do in reality. And I question this because I think that's the biggest legacy Cuba has, the ideological part, but the use of discourse as a tool to make people believe they are from a certain label or a certain ideology when they are using basically only the idea to make the world believe that they are leftist when they're not. And I think this is really important because, for example, when Nicaragua is labeled as a communist country and then you see, for example, that the policies that they implement, they're totally neoliberal. And it's very confusing at the beginning, but it is that way. So it is important to know that they basically only use the labels and the discourse for that. And I think that's no secret as well that Cuba not only influences in this aspect, but also, for example, in the last few years, the Cuban presence in Nicaragua has become bigger. Cuba, for example, provides intelligence and counterintelligence advisory for the Nicaraguan military. And I think that's very important because the thing is that in a crisis, having Cuban advisory also means that they are preparing for something bigger, and they are, and Cuba is messing in internal situations of these countries. I think the Venezuelan people have also denounced this type of things. So, yeah, I think that when you ask what is the biggest heritage, I think it's using ideology as a discourse tool to make people believe something when they're not, and I think Tania could explain this much better, because what we are seeing is political elites that are using a discourse for basically getting rich and implement policies that are not for the people.
Thank you, Danae. I know we are all very enthusiastic here, but because we don't have a lot of time, let's leave the applauses for the end. That's okay, but I mean, it's because I know everybody is very eloquent in their presentation, so everybody would like to applaud. So, I mean, I'd like to ask Tania Bruguera, who's a well-known artist, not only in Cuba, but globally, but as the Cuban in this panel, I'd like to ask Tania, are there any changes in Cuba? Is the Cuban society changing? Is the Cuban regime changing? Are there any aspects that could, say, contribute to maybe a little bit of a different view, a different perspective in terms of adding to some optimism in terms of changes or positive changes in the island? If there aren't, there aren't, but if you could highlight some of them if they are.
Yeah, I think some of the changes were said by you, like Cuba is not a socialist revolution, it's a neoliberal system, where the government is the one, the gentrifier per excellence of the country, where they let some places that were schools, hospitals, cultural institutions to decay so they can destroy it and build hotels. So we need to start changing the image of Cuba. The biggest legacy of Cuban Revolution is the amazing propaganda they have done for 60 years, where all of you still here have a little happiness when you hear Cuba in the back of your brain. You have to understand that Cuba is a dictatorship that has repressed the artists, has repressed the dissident, has repressed the people. In this moment, Cuba has changed, yes, because we had elections 2 days ago where not even the people in the assembly who were going to elect the people knew who were the candidates. That's the change we have in Cuba at the moment, where they are so shameless with the dictatorship, they don't even pretend anymore. The other change is that Cuban government has used the law now to enforce all of their social disparity and all of the privilege of the people in power. I think something that has changed is people have realized, finally in Cuba, that the law is not for everybody. The law is not for the people in power. They have an exception, and that is shown all the time. I think also one thing that they have done really well now is, I call it the revolution of the headlines, because Cuba is very good at announcing something. For example, Cubans can now travel freely. That's a headline everywhere in the world, but people don't have a follow-up writing on that, where you have today, and I have the list of the name in case somebody asks, of 152 people who have been regulated and cannot leave the country. Some of them were going to come to this conference. They were not allowed by the Cuban government to leave the country. So we only have on the outside of Cuba these headlines where we are happy that things are changing, but are we looking behind the headlines? Are we reading the whole article? Are we having a follow-up article? And I think one of the things we need today in the world is investigative journalism about Cuba. We need to start stopping the exception Cuba has. For example, when you have a news about arms in a boat that goes to North Korea, where is the follow-up article about that? When you have an article that says that Cubans are actually, the Cuban special security is in Venezuela, where is the follow-up of that? So I think one thing that can help change even more is if we have investigative journalism that people in Cuba also can read and see how come the government asks more and more sacrifice from the people, but they, in this cupola, in this elite, have not done any sacrifice and will not go under any sacrifice. So I think these are things that are changing. Another thing that has changed is that I think the government is afraid of the people. This is something new for me. I never saw this. The current president and the previous one, Raúl, they were afraid of the people. And I think people smell that, and they know that. And you have seen the current president, Díaz-Canel, going after a few days to this hurricane disaster place, and the people saying, leave, go away. That's one of the most strong videos I've seen in the last 30 years, where the people are saying, the president of Cuba, leave, you are not welcome here. And of course, he left where? To his Mercedes-Benz of the year, of course. So this is something that has changed. You have seen, for example, videos of people where they are defending some dissidents when the police is being aggressive with them, even take them out of the police car. That's also something new. And I think, yes, we have something that is new is in this fake fake vote for the new quote-unquote constitution. We had around 2 million people of like what, 9 or 10 that could vote that did not vote or vote no. That is different because before people think something, they didn't share it because they were afraid. But now people know that 1 in every 4 or 5 people in the room will think like them. And that gives people the license to start talking and to start protesting. And I think, yeah. And I think, for example, a good example of that is Twitter. A lot of people have taken Twitter to ask some questions to the people in power, which is new. And of course, like Cuba always functions, the president presents to the world that they are e-government because they are now in Twitter, but 2 or 3 weeks later, he makes a little law saying that nobody can offend them, or so it's really not working as it should. So Cuba is a fake government that doesn't represent the people and that actually is playing with the old, friends about pretending to be a socialist, but it's not. So I think this is what I think has changed or not changed. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Tanya. As I mentioned earlier, we will leave the applauses for the end, because otherwise, we'll spend more time applauding than speaking. So in a follow-up of this idea of change, I'd like to ask Wilhelm. You mentioned in your first remarks that the international context is getting more complicated for Cuba, for the endurance of the regime. Could you expand on this idea?
Yes, we can see that, as I mentioned, in earlier times, for nearly 40 years in a row, Cuba was supported by the Soviet Union, and then with some years later, they had now around nearly, again, 15 years at least, support by Venezuela. The price for Venezuela is that the Cubans are very strong, controlling actually the government in Venezuela, because this is more or less the last point for Cuba where they can get some economic benefit. They lost the support of Brazil, which over the last 10-15 since the Lula government from 2002 on, was very strong. You know that a lot of doctors, for instance, from Cuba went to Brazil with a special program, Mais Médicos, and Brazil paid annually around 300 to 500 million US dollar for the doctors. The doctors did not see so much of this money, but the money was changed as always to official in the official exchange rate to the families of the doctors, but for the government it was a good business. We had also other Latin American governments supporting Cuba. The left-wing governments, Argentina played also a role. It is also losing. Actually, Cuba has still some kind of support with from Russia, and also some kind of an increasing support, it seems, from China. This will bring it in a new form of dependency. But the ideological attractiveness of Cuba went down. You know that in Latin America they tried to build up some regional parallel organizations parallel to the to the Organization of American States to keep the United States out. But these parallel organizations do not work very well, and so Cuba does not really benefit, because the promoters of these parallel organizations, like Brazilians, PT government, Lula, and later Dilma, or Cristina Kirchner from Argentina, are not as strong or not present anymore, and Evo Morales, he did benefit more from the grants from Venezuela than he could spend by his own for Cuba. So he could only give some political support. So all in all, it seems to me, well, and also the benefits from the United States, which at the first moment were quite helpful for Cuba. The move of the in the late years of the Obama government brought a lot of new tourists, US tourists to Cuba, which meant a lot of money. But now with the new Trump government and new restrictions on the visa for United States citizens, it has decreased sharply, and this means also a kind of economic loss for the region.
And I'd like to explore this idea further with Danai. How do you see this expressed in Nicaragua? I mean, Wilhelm just said that the ideological attractiveness of Cuba has faded. However, it seems contradictory with the fact that both Venezuela and Nicaragua have embraced the alleged values of the Cuban Revolution to inspire the current government. So how do you see this, say, interplay between fading attractiveness of the Cuban Revolution overall, but their relevance, and at least in these two relevant cases, Venezuela and Nicaragua?
I think not only Venezuela and Nicaragua, Ecuador has also a strong support for Cuba, Bolivia as well. But I think, and this is something that some people in the region have started to talk about, is that this ideological division between left and right is not always clear anymore in our societies. So in that sense, ideologically it's not attractive anymore because no one is talking about that. I mean, we have in the region a left-wing dictatorship and right-wing dictatorships as well. So I think, yeah, it has lose attractiveness, but it's because, I mean, at least my generation is talking more about the authoritarianism and the things behind that, and not specifically the ideology, because we have seen, as I said before, that ideology is only a tool. It's only something that they use to create a discourse, to create, you know, a group saying that they follow certain values, but at the end of the day, they are all the same thing, and they apply all the same. They are all dictators from the same textbook. So,
thank you, Tanya. I think I'd like to explore further with you this idea that you also mentioned, that the government is afraid of the people, and explore further how is that expressing, but more from the standpoint of the people. What are the people doing? What signals are the people sending to the government that are making the government afraid?
Yeah, before that, I want to comment on something you said. I don't think that there is a fade of the enthusiasm for Cuba ideologically. I think there is a danger on seeing things as they are evolving in front of our eyes, instead of looking at the history Cuba has of training of all these people in Latin America. When you see that Maduro was training Cuba 20 years before he was president, you have to understand how Cuba operates. Cuba doesn't care if he's now popular or not. As we speak, there is a conference in Cuba right now for legal lawyers and judges of Latin America to think about what is the problem with democracy in Latin America. This is a way for them to capture agents of interest, to capture potential collaborators in, not today, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. So we have to stop thinking and getting enthusiastic about Cuba because today there is some disagreement. No, we have to we have to dismantle the system. We have to dismantle that system that has been for 60 years, because they don't work for today. They work for in 30, 40 years. So that's how they have the advantage with us, that we think on today. So I think I just wanted to make that, yeah, sorry. But in terms of signaling, I think is basically when you see, for example, the Cuban government, when they were doing the constitution, bend over the church, because I think it's the Protestant evangelist, I think, church, decide that same-sex marriage was going to be a problem for them, and they will tell all the feligrenos, all their followers, to not vote for the constitution. That's the moment where you can see how weak the Cuban government is. If you're strong, you can say, we believe in people, we know people believe in us and they're going to vote for us, you know? They were so weak that they bent over the church. That was, for me, very important, because the first time in the 60 years that the government bent over another institution. And they were afraid because all they wanted is a headline. Cuban Constitution passed. Doesn't matter what is inside the Constitution. The headline is the important part. So I think that shows the weakness. It shows the weakness that a lot of the parents of the people in the elite are looking to put businesses outside of Cuba. They're taking all the money outside of Cuba, and they are living a life that has nothing to do with the Cuban people. When you see, for example, that the granddaughter of Raúl Castro is renting her apartment for $600 a night on Airbnb, you understand that the government is weak because they're already looking for other solutions, right? They are not looking for maybe staying in power. Maybe the daughter and the brother, yes, but the third generation is already disconnected from this project. So I think you have this in one side. You have in another side a lot of, for example, there was a French corporation that did this luxurious hotel in Havana. They brought from India to build the hotel. Why? Because the government was afraid to train the Cubans on a new technique for construction and for the Cubans to have $1,200 per month as a salary. That means the Cuban government is nervous. Why? Because they don't want the Cubans to progress. They are afraid of people with money. They say yes to the businesses, but the businesses are all controlled. Because they don't want you to have too much money, so you have independence of thinking and independence of agency. So I think this is how I think it is. And as I said before, I think a lot of people are realizing that the government is making mistakes. They are shooting at people. They are taking people in prison for no reason, hitting people. And the Cuban people had enough. And they are actually sometimes get in between the police and the people who's being attacked. And that, for me, is a great sign of, we're not there yet, but I think there are some signs. Yeah.
And talking about, thank you, Tanya, or why don't we continue with you, focus on the artists, because as an artist, I'd like to hear what's your perspective of the role of artists.
No, I think art, and I said this last year when I was here, I say the artists will lead the revolution in Cuba, and I think we are actually at least making some noise. And I think I'm very proud to say that for the first time since 1962, when the artists met with Fidel and Fidel decided that with the revolution, everything, without the revolution, no right. So he made it legal. For the first time since that time, the artists got together because of the 349. A law that was the first law signed by the Cuban president, which legalized censorship in Cuba. And it was a very interesting moment because everybody felt attacked by this law. Because people know the ramification of censorship and they understand what it means. But also it was interesting that at some point in all these discussions where they were accusing us of wanted to have child pornography. Like there were like all these insane accusations of the people who were against the law, or that we were anarchists and we didn't like institutions and we want the shooting of the Minister of Culture. What it was clear is that the Minister of Culture in Cuba works with the Minister of the Interior. That's what's very clear to everybody outside of Cuba. And it was also very clear that the Ministry of Culture have no control anymore over the artists. They have lost their sense of being, which is controlling the artist. And the independent artists in cinema, theater, writing, visual arts are growing very much and are creating their own projects that are parallel to the propaganda of the state.
Thank you.
So I hope we go somewhere with that.
And well, and Tanya is a good expression of the activism of the artists in Cuba. Wilhelm, you mentioned that one of the weaknesses of Cuba, one of the weaknesses of the prospects for a transition in Cuba is the, in turn, weakness of the democratic forces. Could you analyze what exactly is happening with the democratic forces in Cuba, and also tie your thinking with the, say, the lessons that can be learned from transitions in the communist world that are kind of the theme of this conference?
Well, we have mentioned already that earlier this year in February, a new constitution has been approved by plebiscite, whatever. And there was a lot of expectation that the constitution would open the door for some kind of political reform. Among observers, there is a kind of discussion whether the constitution really opens the way for reform or not. We have to state that the constitution says, among others, solo en el socialismo y el comunismo el ser humano alcanza su dignidad plena. Only in socialism and communism the human being will reach his full dignity. Yeah, I think here in Czechoslovakia, you know about these phrases in the past, but this shows, this underline, that the political character of the regime is not presumed to change. The constitution allows, in a very general way, private property or more private property, economic opening and some kind of private sector activities, but it is not very well defined how far the regime would really go if all these developments in the economic or eventually also in the political area really would mean loss of control for the regime. So the space, the area for political opposition seems to me still very narrow, very limited. You have mentioned some areas where we can see at the social level, at the societal level, some changes. Yeah? The evangelical, also the churches, are an interesting phenomenon. Yeah? They are normally not very prominent as fighters for democracy, but they are fighters for some principles which are against the regime. And so they can, at one moment, they can choke with the regime if the regime will not, in a certain way, integrate them or adapt them. Yeah, you have also mentioned the sector of art. So for real political opposition, the possibilities are still quite limited. The control is still very perfect. Yeah, and so for political opposition, it is rather difficult. So therefore, the perspective, in my point of view, for a real transition are also quite limited. In earlier times, we thought that perhaps with the Catholic Church there could be some changes, and of course, in the context of the Church, there are some movements or some groupings which are thinking in a different way. Yeah? But to transform this different thinking into an organizational context or network or something, this always have been very, very complicated in the past, and it is still very complicated in the present. And I also have the impression that groups from outside do not have so much influence on developments inside Cuba. Also, of course, they are very concerned and very engaged. So we have seen, if we compare Cuba with the transition processes in Europe, for instance, we can see that in Europe there was a growing social and later on also political space for organizational for disagreement and for some kind of opposition. If we look to Czechoslovakia in the old times, or if you look to Poland, if we look to Hungary, there have also been some opposition groups, and the repression of the regime did not go so far to exclude these kind of expressions. Yeah? And I would say that the control in Cuba is still much stronger. Yeah? And the cohesion of the elite, as I mentioned at the beginning. The elite, the political elite knows or is aware that only if they stand together, they will be able to defend the system. And there is also, the Díaz-Canel is not a representative or member of the armed forces, but there is still also this very close link between the political and the armed forces, the political sector and the armed forces. So you don't see a split. Yeah. In the late years of the Soviet regime, we had, I would not say a split, but we had some discrepancies among the Communist Party and some difficulties also among the political elite and the military elite. It was not as close as it is still in Cuba. So therefore, I'm not very optimistic regarding a very soon real political transition.
Thank you, Wilhelm. Danai, you're a journalist and you're part of the CPJ consortium. You work in Central America. And Tanya mentioned that, or recommended more investigative journalism in regards to Cuba. What do you think? I mean, what are the prospects for consortiums such as the CPJ and journalists in the region in regards to addressing Cuba, and also tying this with the prospects of transitions? If, as Wilhelm says, the internal opposition may be still weak, maybe the drive for a transition can be aided or helped from abroad. So what's the role of journalists and providing more information, shedding more light on Cuba in regards to the prospects of a democratic transition for the island?
Well, I totally agree with Tanya. I think we always need more investigative journalism. I do think, however, that it is a hard thing to say because, of course, authoritarian regimes are not friends of the press. So I first think that organizations as the CPJ, which promotes press freedom worldwide, and other organizations as well, have a role to play, not only denouncing the attacks of the press, but creating ways in which maybe Cuban journalists can work from abroad but report on Cuba, which I think there are some media that are doing that as well, and create these spaces so journalists feel that they can talk and they will have someone supporting them. Because I think that's something that throughout the region, journalists are afraid of reporting. It's not that they are not capable of, it's not that they don't know how to, it's just that they feel that if they publish something that could put them in danger, there will be no one to protect them. So in this case, I think organizations as CPJ, as Reporters Without Borders, do a very good job, but I do think that also activists and other civil society organizations have a role to play on that, because journalists need to feel that they are strongly supported by the people, by the audiences, and that's something that people need to be aware. If the audience protects the journalists, that's more strong than any organization could do. And of course, thinking about transitions, it is very difficult to say because we are right now experiencing in the region a series of crises, not only in Central America, also in South America, Cuba. So thinking about transitions, I think it's very broad because every country has its specific needs. I do think that the transition, however, is also a transition on viewing things. I think before things were very black and white for the past generations. I think newer generations are thinking more of democracy as a way to promote things like women's rights, to promote things as climate change policy making. So I do think that any transition in every country has this point, but of course, in the Nicaraguan case, for example, transition is something that we are always talking about, but it has a specific requirements and it's a specific needs of the country. Like, for example, we didn't have a strong opposition in the past year, so we need to build up on that. I think the Venezuelan case, it's somehow different because you always have parties that were strong against the Maduro regime and so on. So I do think that in that case, the view on transition is a less black and white, these are the bad ones, we are the good guys, and more of a broad thing that should have also people from the left, people from the right, people from different civil organizations that are working towards creating a new country.
Yeah. If you would like me to add something. Some 20 years ago or so, when the Helms-Burden law was discussed in the US Congress, I published an article in a German newspaper saying that it would be better to open some McDonalds in Havana, because this eventually would have more effect on political transition, undermining the regime. We'll say, I think we have also to talk about the United States policies or politics towards Cuba. Probably, without this fierce stance of the United States against the regime, some aspects or some aspects of the character of the regime would not have endured so long time, because the regime, the legitimacy of the regime was always in a big part not only based on ideology, because nobody believes in this ideology, but it was always defending the revolution, defending the independence of the island and so on and so forth against the United States, and eventual intervention or attack or so on and so forth. Perhaps in our days there would be more space also for policymakers or in the United States, because we know that now the Cuban society is not as important anymore in some swing states for the American elections. In earlier times, it was very necessary for some candidates in the US elections to satisfy the Cubans in Florida. In our days, they don't play that role anymore, and they are also not as cohesion as they have been in earlier times regarding US elections and so on and so forth. So perhaps the more restrictive position now of the Trump government indirectly again helps the Cuban regime, and this is not very helpful with regard to political transition or transformation.
Thank you, William.
Can I say something very quickly?
Yes.
If the McDonald's in Cuba are owned by the army and the generals and the people in power, then what is the role of the McDonald's in Cuba?
No.
You know?
No,
but this is what happened. This is what happened. Cuba had a unique opportunity with Obama, and they blew it. Yes. They blew it because the arrogance, the ambition, and the egoism of the people in government. They had one chance. Obama opened the doors, and they blew it. Why? Yeah. Because they were. If you were in Cuba, you could talk to the people in the taxi drivers, the people who own businesses. They were mad because they didn't see the progress. They didn't see. They didn't get un progreso. They didn't get anything out of the Obama things because tourists, those tourists you talk about that were so good for Cuba, they came from the airport in a little bus directly to the army hotels, owned by Gaesa and all the army people, and the money was not flowing in around the people. It was only for the government. Then, what happened with the money? You know how much money the Cuban government got in the Obama era? What did they do with the money? They didn't build new hotels, they didn't build new hospitals, they didn't make a better education, they didn't do anything. Where it's going? To Venezuela, to Nicaragua, to Ecuador, to train people. That's where the money is going. You know, so don't say McDonald's, because this is the problem of having a view of Cuba that is archetypical. You cannot look at Cuba in archetypes. You have to look at how the system works. And Cuba is one of the best examples of fake news.
Yeah, but this
and
would...
so, you know, so I just wanted that little point. You know, just I was a little nervous about the McDonald's in a different way than the leftists are. So you know, so I think it's important to understand, follow the money. That's a very old thing, you know.
But this means that you would not give any chance for political transition.
No, I will do, no. I will open up, okay, you can open up, but then look at the small text underneath the contract, where it says, for example, I'm part of a group that protests against the Cuban government because they open up for the, ¿cómo se llaman los barcos estos? The cruisers to go to Cuba. But the Obama administration didn't look that underneath, very small, say, no Cubans. This is the problem. They look at the happiness of the headlines. Now cruisers can go to Cuba, but Cubans cannot go. So I had to protest with a group of other Cubans that they have to, this is the thing, Americans are great, but they are naive.
No.
They don't know how to deal with the Cuban government. Cuban government is people from the street, streetwise. And the people in American government are nice people who think they're going to talk and follow what they, no.
Well,
they didn't do that.
My joke with the McDonald's is the question: what could contribute to open up a little bit the space, yeah? And therefore, of course, you cannot do political education programs in Cuba. You have to look for other means. And if you say Obama, unfortunately, Obama did it in his last year in government, so you could not have. Not yet effects. Of course, the money will first go to the government-run hotels and so on. And the McDonald's, if it would come to Cuba as well as it came to Beijing or to Moscow in the earlier years.
There was no open competition for any business.
Yeah, of course.
You know?
But the problem is how to open the mind of the people, how to get a little bit...
You have to force them. The Cuban government is not going to open any mind.
How to show them some alternatives.
You have to force them with the economy, with the opportunities, by saying, we're doing this way. We're not going to give you all the opportunity. We're going to do it if you guarantee that it's an open competition for the post, that you have, for example, that you don't take in prison people who are dissidents, that you will suspend censorship, you will suspend, you know, you have to put conditions.
Okay,
you
so we
cannot
have
be open to things to be the same.
We have 10 more minutes.
Sorry,
I'd like to open it for the audience.
I'm a little passionate.
So I think the last conversation is, I hope some of the questions will relate to this last conversation.
I just think that the Americans are not naive, they just don't care.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with the correction. Americans are not naive; they don't care.
Well, I think all of that is open for discussion. I think, as you mentioned earlier, black and white may not fit the conversation right now. So the last portion of this conversation was about how to open the system, how to push the system to a transition, which involves not only the government and probably mainly how to organize people, how to take advantage of things that are changing, the new awareness in some of the Cuba's society. So if we could focus on that, because that's like the main topic for this panel. So, okay.
Hello, I was actually on a panel here 4 years ago.
Could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Glenn Gephardt. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. I'm a filmmaker. I was on a panel here 4 years ago with Osvaldo Paya, who recently was beat up. So I was... Osvaldo Paya was murdered 7 years ago. Maybe I'm thinking of it. I'm sorry, not the one guy. Anyway. I think one of the issues with McDonald's in Cuba, I've been in Cuba many times, I always said, once McDonald's is in Cuba, I'll never go again. It's a really old question. Why was the Cuban Revolution, for one? And a lot of it was the Platt Amendment, neocolonialism by the United States, right? But I think one of the problems I find in Cuba is Cubans don't know their own history. The Cuban Revolution was not a communist revolution. There were other leaders of the revolution. Fidel didn't take over until 1958, the strike in 1958. Frank País, Jose Antonio Echeverría, the Directorio Revolucionario, etc. And those issues in Cuba were forgotten, or there was disinformation about that as soon as Fidel took over. And those names are kind of vague at this point. And what I find is young Cubans, old Cubans know their history. If somebody's 70 years old, 75, 80 years old, they know their history. But I find 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, you say the name Jose Antonio Echeverría, oh yeah, he worked for Fidel. He didn't work for Fidel, they were like this. So I think one of the problems with Cuba is not just investigative journalism, but it's Cubans understanding their own history. Fidel's...
sorry, we have
I'll just say one
many
more
people.
thing. Fidel, in a sense, was the counter-revolution.
We need time to speak.
Don't interrupt, please, sir. Sir,
We don't care about history anymore. We need to confront.
please respect the right of the
Democracia,
the
caballero.
person here.
That's hindering democracy.
Okay. Sorry, you were...
We only have 5 more minutes. I please request very short questions and not interrupting people while they are speaking.
You finish?
Please.
Very short. Cuba now is a one-party system, okay? Totalitarian state with an official ideology which is not communist, socialist, or whatever, but what the Politburo think is some kind of ideology. They can mix Martí with Marx and Engels, with Fidel Castro now. Is his turn. Everybody will say, Fidel say so, because this one-party system, we got the political repression, and the opposition is weak, because the opposition in Cuba must take the people on its side without...
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Yes, without the state security knowing about it, okay? And after that, I'm talking about Cuba right now. We got a monopoly in economy.
And a question, do you have a specific
and the
question?
Is, the only thing we can ask, not to the Cuban people, but from the people outside, is to get coordinated. Because the European Union is taking the Lisbon Treaty. They don't care about it. So, my question is, what the international community could do to help Cuban people fighting inside?
Thank you very much. There are several questions. I can only have Carl. Yes.
I would like Tanya, if you would,
Yeah.
to elaborate on your response to, by the way, it's not only the Americans who are naive, Germans can be naive too.
Everybody, yeah. Regarding Cuba, everybody's naive.
I mean, I just want to hear you. You responded to the defense of the Obama policy of open.
Yeah.
Respond, to the criticism of the embargo, the criticism of the policy in the United States of isolating Cuba. And is that good? How can it be done differently? What do the Cuban activists think of that policy?
Okay, so we only have 2 more minutes, so I'll give the panelists the chance to respond. If it's short?
Yes, it's short.
Okay.
Very short, please.
We have 2 minutes, so take that into account.
Okay. We are part of the Cuba Demanda, and we believe that the only way to make change in Cuba is a total confrontation with the Cuban government. My question is, do you think that using their own law would be helpful in this fight against the Cuban government?
Tanya.
Yes, let's Tanya, let's give the
I want
chance
to thank
Tanya.
you, sir, the filmmaker, I don't know the name. Glenn, for what you say. You're totally right. I think part of what happened in Cuba is people don't remember history, but this is not by chance. This is because the government has created an education system that erases everything that is dissident or questioning, etc. This is why I'm doing now in Cuba a project called the Institute for Art and Activism Hannah Arendt. And we have right now a prize for investigative journalism. We have a prize for history. So somebody who wants to write or who is writing a book about history, a history that is different from the official one. And we have, of course, a prize for social work. So we want people to start engaging the social fabric of Cuba, because this is also sometimes left alone. And we also have prizes for art, who are independent. I think one of the ways I think work the best is multi-attack, let's say, multi-work, meaning that one thing I find out in a way is the Cuban government has limited resources in a way. So if you do 3 events at the same time, they might not have enough police to send to all of the events. So I think we need to do everything at the same time. We need to work with the people. We need to rescue history. We need to teach people what is really happening behind the scene with information. And also, young people are not so, in my experience, are not so into union. They want dispersed. They're from the internet era, so they like dispersity. They don't like to be easy targeted. So this is very quickly that. And I recommend to read a new declaration by the independent journalist in Cuba who did and sent to the government. I agree with the law. It has been part of my strategy, using the law against the government and showing how the law is unfair and is not for everyone, because there are people for whom the law doesn't apply in Cuba. And actually we're preparing, don't put this on the internet, but we're preparing actually, I did the demand of the government for defamation. I put a case for defamation to the Cuban government. They laugh on me, but they know they had to give me a paper. So now we're preparing a group demand of this defamation to the Cuban government. So this is one of my strategies, use the law, because we want to show that the law is not real, and all this new constitution is fake. In terms of the strategy, I'm not a politician. I might not give you the best answer. I'm just an activist and an artist, passionate for freedom of expression, or for freedom of my country. People here who are more political involved might give you a better answer, but I think you have to see not like, is it good or is it bad? Does embargo is good or Obama policy is good? No, you cannot see it that way. We have to see what was the context. When the Helm-Burton and all these things were happening, Cuba had the support of the European, the Russians, the Soviet Union, sorry.
Oh,
with Obama, I think for me it was very painful, because I was a defender of the Obama policy. And people here know that. Like, I was defender against some other dissident who didn't like it. And I say, no, this is great. But of course, I didn't calculate what the Cuban government was going to do, which is, again, fake it. That's the problem. Cuban is a fake news, fake government, fake history. It's a fake. It's a construction. So unless you understand that this is all fake, and you're going to go inside the way the system creates the fakeness, it's impossible for me to understand what policy works and what not. So I'm sorry I couldn't answer.
So, well, unfortunately, I'm being very much pressed to end the session.
Sure.
I think it has been a very interesting session. I think one of the interesting aspects has been to highlight the changes, changes in the international context, and also the changes inside Cuba that may guide us to understand where are the prospects for change, where are the prospects for transitions, and So I wanna thank all of you for being here, and especially for the panelists for their very interesting and rich contribution. Thank you very much.